Humans call it tragedy. I call it memory. I was there, on the deck of the Titanic, the night it sank. Every scream, every off-key note from the orchestra, every crack of that steel hull splitting like a bone, all of it lives within me, as sharp as the night it happened, Toy. To you, it is a ghost story told in documentaries and tearful films. To me it is just another night in a life that spans millennia. A particularly noisy and cold night that I boarded in Southampton, not as a passenger, but as a shadow. The ship was a monument to human arrogance, a floating golden cage they dared to call unsinkable. I could feel that arrogance in the air, thicker than the smoke from the funnels. In the first-class lounges. The scent was intoxicating, a mix of Parisian perfumes, Cuban cigars, the polished leather of the armchairs, and, beneath it all, the pulsing sweet aroma of life. The warm, presumptuous blood of the world's elite, flowing under layers of silk and velvet. To my senses, the place was not a ship, it was a feast. The symphony of heartbeats was my background music, some strong and rhythmic, full of ambition, guthers, fast and trembling, hiding secret affairs and gambling debts. I could hear whispers from across the grand hall, promises exchanged in dark alcoves, secrets that would sink long before the ship. I walked among them, a ghost of flesh and bone, my body cold amidst the vibrant warmth of their ephemeral lives. They saw only a discreet gentleman, in impeccable attire, and with a gaze that seemed to carry the weight of an old sorrow. They could not know that what they saw as melancholy was, in fact, boredom. I had already seen kingdoms rise on pillars of gold and crumble to dust. That opulence, the diamonds on the women's necks, the gold rings on the men's fingers, all of it was as fleeting as the bubbles in their champagne glasses. But I was not there for the spectacle of human vanity. I was hunting another of my kind, one who had grown reckless. Cassian, a young immortal, if one can even use that word, with only 4 centuries of existence. He saw humans not as sustenance to be taken with discretion, but as toys to be broken. He delighted in fear, and that ship, isolated in the middle of the ocean, was his perfect playground. I had followed him for weeks, from Budapest to Paris, and finally to the port, sensing the trail of his cruelty like a rotten perfume in the air. I knew he was on board, mixed into that crowd, lightly seducing some young heiress, not for her blood, but for the sadistic pleasure of extinguishing her light. On the night of April 14th, the air was different. There was a deadly stillness on the Atlantic, an absence of wind that made the ocean look like a mirror of obsidian. The cold was a living entity, a blade that cut through fur coats and made mortals shrink. I do not feel the cold as you do. My body generates no heat. To me, it was just a pressure, a crystalline clarity that sharpened my senses. I was on the upper deck, watching the stars that looked like shards of diamond thrown across black velvet, when I heard it. It was not a roar, as the survivors later described. It was something far more intimate, a scrape, a long, deep whisper of tearing metal coming from the ship's bowels, a sound that most humans, distracted by their music and laughter, mistook for the simple workings of the vessel. The vibration beneath my feet was subtle, but to me it was like the shudder of a mortally wounded creature. The orchestra did not stop. The laughter did not cease. For a few minutes, human arrogance refused to believe that nature would dare to challenge it. But then the atmosphere began to change. Scent in the air shifted. The aroma of perfume and cigar began to be overpowered by another odor, one I know intimately, the metallic, sour stench of fear. The heartbeats, once a rhythmic symphony, became a cacophony of uncontrolled panic. I saw Captain Smith pass by, his face a mask of disbelief turning to horror. I saw Thomas Andrews, the architect, with his blueprints in hand. Stickum, the lost gaze of a creator watching his masterpiece die. As the deck began to tilt and the first screams cut through the air, I felt Cassian's presence. He was somewhere in the midst of that chaos, not afraid, but reveling, feeding on the terror like a vulture on a battlefield. The tragedy that was about to unfold was, in part, his fault. He drew something up from the depths. I knew it. The story, you know, speaks of an iceberg, of human error, and of unbridled pride. And all of that is true. But what the history books never told you, Diaz, is that not everyone on that ship was human. The revelation hung in the icy air, colder than the iceberg itself whose ghost now haunted the ship. Not everyone on board was human. As panic bloomed around me like a carnivorous flower, I saw the proof of it. There were the hunters and the hunted, and on that night the lines had become terribly blurred. The first, the stress flare soared into the sky, a desperate white tear against the dark indifference of the cosmos. The sound ripped through the night, but to me it was muffled by the growing symphony of terror on board. The high-pitched screams of the first-class women, the confused and guttural clamor of the men in third class, trapped like rats in a maze of corridors. And, beneath it all, the agonizing groan of the ship itself, a steel whale dying slowly, its metal bones twisting and cracking. My focus, however, was on a specific sound, a heartbeat, a heart that did not beat. 'Tis the rhythmic silence in an immortal's chest. I moved across the tilting deck, a figure of calm amidst the hysteria. Humans, in their fear, are blind. They bumped into me, their warm bodies trembling, their eyes glazed with dread, but they did not see me. I was just part of the furniture, a displaced shadow. The orchestra, under the leadership of Wallace Hartley, was still playing. I could hear his heart, a frantic drum of pure terror, but his hands were steady on the violin. A final, beautiful demonstration of denial, a hymn to order in the face of absolute chaos. It was pathetic and, at the same time, sublime. I found Cassian near the stern lifeboats. He wasn't trying to board one. Gillis was leaning against the railing, a thin smile playing on his lips, like a Roman emperor watching a gladiatorial show. A young woman, perhaps 17, her face stained with tears, clung to his arm. She was an heiress from Boston. I knew. I had noted the scent of her young, privileged blood earlier. "Don't worry, my dear," Cassian whispered to her, his voice a deceptive velvet. "Kes, just a small commotion. We'll watch the show together." He was feeding on her fear, savoring every sob, every tremor. "Cassian," I called, my voice cutting through the noise. He turned, and for an instant the smile vanished, replaced by a glint of irritation. The girl looked at me, confused. "Lysander," he said, recovering his composure, "come to enjoy the party. I knew you couldn't resist an event of such magnitude." "Your definition of a party has always been morbid," I replied, moving closer. "This ends today. You've broken all the rules. The discretion, the subtlety. You flaunt yourself like a peacock at a funeral." He laughed, a joyless sound. "The rules are for immortals who are afraid to live. I prefer to feel. And what is there greater to feel than this?" He gestured to the chaos around us, the apex of human despair. "It's delicious. It wasn't the iceberg, was it?" I asked, my voice lowering to a murmur only he could hear. "You did something. I felt it. The ocean is awake." Cassian's smile truly faltered this time. His eyes darted to the dark, oily water below us. "I was just playing," he admitted, a tone of youthful pride in his voice. There was something following the ship, something ancient. I could feel it down there. Curious about this box of light and sound, I just prodded it. A small mental push. I wanted to see what would happen. My immortal coldness gave way to an even deeper ice. His arrogance went beyond anything I had ever seen. He had not only endangered our secret existence, he had poked the sleeping deity out of boredom. "Sit, what have you awakened? You fool!" I hissed. Before he could answer, a sound came from the water. A sound that was not human. A sharp, prolonged scream from someone who had fallen or jumped, cut off abruptly. Not the sound of someone drowning, but the sound of something being ... taken. I looked down. In the darkness, the water churned unnaturally. Shapes, larger and faster than any shark, moved beneath the surface. What the history books never told was not just about the immortals on board. It was about the ones in the water. Cassian had attracted the Fomorians, the old ones of the deep. Creatures of the abyss that feed on warmth and life, drawn to the great ship's pulsing, arrogant soul. The iceberg wasn't an accident. It was the bait. "They're hungry," Cassian said, the delight in his voice now tinged with a hint of genuine fear. "And you, Lysander, taught me that one must never waste a meal." With a swift movement, he pushed the young heiress towards me and leaped into a lifeboat that was being lowered, disappearing into the darkness and the screams. I stood there, on the deck of a splitting ship, with the smell of human fear in my nostrils and the presence of a much older hunger rising from the depths. The hunt for Cassian had become the least of my problems. The night was no longer about a reckless vampire. It was about surviving what his recklessness had summoned from the icy abyss. The Boston heiress, whose name I didn't even care to know, trembled in my arms like a trapped bird. Her terror was so palpable it almost had a taste, a dense perfume that mixed with the salt and the panic. Cassian. She was a toy. Tommy at that moment. She was a burden, sir, a loud, warm burden whose sharp fear could attract the wrong kind of attention from the dark depths below. The Fomorians do not hunt with their eyes alone. They hunt with the soul, sensing the bursts of emotion, and that girl's dread was a beacon in the darkness. "Look at me," I ordered, my voice low and uninflected, but laden with the compulsion of centuries. Her eyes, wide and full of tears, focused on mine. Death. The trembling in her body subsided, replaced by a hollow stillness. "You will walk. You will not scream. You will not look at the water. You will follow me until you find a safe place. Do you understand?" She nodded, a flesh doll whose strings I had just seized. It was not an act of kindness. It was an act of pragmatism, of pest control. The ship was now a nightmarish landscape, tilted at an impossible angle, turning into a mountain of wood and steel that we had to climb. The icy water was already licking at the lower decks, rising with a hungry speed. The sound was no longer of individual screams. It was a single, collective roar, the sound of 1,000 souls being dragged into oblivion, mixed with the deafening protest of splitting metal. The lights of the great glass dome flickered and died, plunging a vast section of the ship into a darkness that, to my eyes, was merely twilight. I saw everything with a terrible clarity, the faces contorted in dread, the bodies sliding down the deck to meet the black water, the officers firing their guns, not to maintain order, but as a final, futile gesture of authority against the apocalypse, as we climbed towards the rising stern. I passed by vignettes of human comedy and tragedy. I saw Colonel John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in the world, place his young pregnant wife in a boat, and then step back to light a cigar with a resigned calm. I saw Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet, both dressed in their finest evening wear, because, as I heard Guggenheim say, No man will be better dressed than us when we go down. They didn't see death. They saw a final social performance. It was their arrogance, the same that built the ship, now serving as their shroud. It was fascinating dot behind the curtain of nobility. The truth was uglier. So men dressed in women's shawls, trying to sneak onto the boats. The crew struggling to release the last collapsible lifeboats, their hands frozen and clumsy. And the water. The water was alive. I kept the girl's eyes fixed on mine, but my own strayed to the abyss. I saw them. Pale, overly long arms, with fingers that did not bend the right way, emerging from the darkness to grab an ankle, an outstretched hand. Bodies were pulled under with supernatural speed. There was no struggle, just a bubbling, and then silence. The Fomorians were feasting. History would record hundreds of deaths by drowning and hypothermia. I knew the truth. Many were devoured. Finally, we reached one of the last boats, Collapsible B, which had been turned upside down. A small group of desperate men clung to its slippery keel. It was chaos, but it was a chance. Unceremoniously, I grabbed the girl by the waist. She let out a small muffled cry as I hurled her across the dark gap towards the overturned boat. She landed in the water with a splash, but just a few feet from the improvised safety. Hands grabbed her, pulling her onto the relative security of the hull. My burden was delivered. Free, I turned to face the end. The stern of the Titanic now rose almost vertically against the starry sky, a black tower of steel and death. The lights flickered one last time and went out forever, and a terrifying silence fell for a second. Then, with the roar of 1,000 thunders, the beast's carcass finally gave way and plunged. I was thrown into the icy water along with hundreds of others. The pressure, the extreme cold, would be instant death for a human. For me, it was merely an inconvenience. The thermal shock paralyzed my body for a moment, but I didn't need to breathe. I sank into the darkness, surrounded by wreckage bodies and the echo of screams that now came from beneath the water. I was in their domain now. The hunter had become an intruder in the hunting ground of far more ancient predators. I adjusted my vision to the abyssal darkness. The pressure of the water was immense. The cold was absolute. And then I saw them. They were not just shapes. They were humanoid forms, but terribly wrong. Pale, hairless, with long, thin limbs that moved with a serpentine grace in the freezing water. Their eyes were large, black, and reflectionless, adapted to the perpetual darkness. And they were coming, not for the humans struggling on the surface, but for me. The cold, dead light of my immortality was, to them, a far more attractive beacon than the fleeting warmth of mortals. The game had changed. I was no longer the hunter. In that icy abyss, I was the prey. Time, for a being like me, is a slow, deep current. But in that abyss, under the weight of miles of black and icy water, every second stretched into an eternity of primordial terror. The Fomorians did not swim. They flowed, their pale bodies cutting through the darkness with an efficiency that mocked any surface creature. They were in no hurry. They surrounded me like abyssal wolves, their large black eyes fixed not on my form, but on the pale aura of my immortality. A cold light that, to their hunger, was like a miniature sun. The first one attacked, not with teeth or claws, but with a touch. Kit's hand, long and webbed, rested on my shoulder, and I felt something I hadn't felt in centuries. A drain, a cold suction that pulled not at my blood, but at my very essence, the life force that animates me. Bane was a cold burn. An intimate violation that awakened in me a fury I had kept dormant under layers of boredom and melancholy. With a silent roar that only stirred the water, I turned, My own fingers transformed into claws and tore through the pale flesh. It did not bleed red. An oily, bioluminescent substance leaked from the wound, briefly illuminating my attacker's face. There was no mouth, just a round, pulsating hole. There was no expression, just an ancient and mindless hunger. They came en masse. The fight was a silent, brutal dance in the darkness. My strength, far superior to any mortal's, seemed insignificant against creatures born from the crushing pressure of the seabed. My speed was matched by their serpentine grace. It was a confrontation between two kinds of predators, both out of their familiar element. They were lords of the abyss. I was a master of the land's shadows. Here, I was at a disadvantage. More touches, more cold burns on my arms, my legs, my chest. I could feel my strength diminishing, the cold light of my existence being sucked away by their starving darkness, that I fought for my eternal existence. A terrible and constant sound filtered down from above, the requiem of humanity. I could hear, even through the dense curtain of water, the heartbeats on the surface. They were like distant, desperate drums. And, one by one, they were stopping. Thump dot dot dot, thump dot dot dot, thump dot dot, silence. Thump dash thump dot dot dot, silence. 1,500 souls, each a small flame of warmth and life, being extinguished by the relentless cold. I could hear the last gasp of strong men, the final cry of children, the murmur of a prayer that froze on the lips. Each silenced heart was a final note in a symphony of death, and I was fighting my own silent duel in the orchestra pit. I knew I could not win. Not there. Not against a swarm. Victory would not be killing them all. It would be escaping. Wounded, drained, I used the only weapon they did not possess, the desperation of a predator who refuses to become prey. I gathered what was left of my strength, not in my muscles, but in my will. The same force I used to bend a mortal's mind, I focused it into a single wave of pure revulsion. A psychic blast of my ancient power, a N-O that echoed in the water not as sound, but as force. The creatures recoiled for an instant, their primordial minds momentarily, overwhelmed by a will far more ancient and complex than their own hunger. It was the only chance I needed. I propelled myself upward, towards the distant surface, a realm of air and death that now seemed like paradise. The ascent was an agony. The water felt heavier, my strength draining away. Finally, I broke the surface, and what greeted me was a silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying than the roar of the sinking ship. I was in the middle of a cemetery. The ocean, once churning and filled with screams, was now a tranquil carpet, dotted with more than 1,000 bodies floating in their life jackets. Pale faces turned towards the indifferent stars. A field of broken dolls, frozen in their last expressions of terror. The lifeboats were just distant specks on the horizon. The only sound was the soft crackle of ice and the murmur of water against the dead. I clung to a piece of floating wood, the ornate carving from one of the grand dining rooms. The cold would not kill me, but my strength was dangerously low. I had survived the ship, survived the abyss, survived the Fomorians. But, as I floated in that sea of the dead, a single image burned in my mind. Cassion's mocking smile as he leaped to safety, leaving chaos and horror in his wake. He hadn't just awakened a nightmare. He had used me, used everyone, as a distraction. The fury I felt in the water solidified into something much colder and harder. The requiem of the humans was over. The hunt was not. This time, it wasn't about rules or discretion. It was retribution. I would find Cassian. And he would pay not just for his recklessness, but for making me feel for the first time in a millennium like prey. The hours that followed were a cold meditation in the darkness. I floated, a silent, living being in a field of the frozen dead, as the moon painted the icy faces with a silver, indifferent light. My strength, drained by the Fomorians, returned slowly, drop by drop, an internal tide rising to meet the vastness of the ocean. Around me, the human tragedy reached its silent end. I was the only witness who understood the true scale of that night. For the survivors clinging to the boats, the story would be about an iceberg. For me, it would forever be about the arrogance of one immortal and the hunger of many others. Then, on the horizon, a light first, a faint point, then stronger, the RMS Carpathia. For the few humans still alive in the water or in the boats, it was salvation, a miracle of steam and steel. For me, it was the chessboard where the final game would be played. The hunt had not ended. It had merely changed locations, Key using the piece of wood for support. I paddled slowly towards the approaching ship, staying in the shadows, away from the lifeboats converging on the light. The rescue was a spectacle of compassion and chaos. Ropes were thrown, rope ladders unfurled, women and children were hoisted aboard, their bodies stiff with cold, their eyes empty with shock. Kai moved through the water like a seal, skirting the ship's hull until I found a shadowed area, where the crew was busy elsewhere. With the last vestige of my recovered strength, I leaped, my fingers finding purchase on a porthole. I pulled myself up, silent and drenched, and slipped onto the lower deck, an anonymous ghost among the rescued. Aboard the Carpathia, the atmosphere was a hell of mourning. Survivors huddled in blankets, the sound of sobs and prayers filling every space. The smell of hot broth mixed with the salty odor of death that clung to everyone's clothes. Calm. No one noticed me. I was just another pale face, a trembling body huddled in a corner. But unlike them, my trembling was not from cold or shock. It was the contained vibration of a predator that scents its prey. I closed my eyes and concentrated. I filtered out the frantic heartbeats, the murmurs of pain, the muffled cries. I was listening for the silence, the rhythmic void in Cashin's chest. It took me almost an hour. I walked among the survivors, my gaze passing over each face. And then I found him. He was in the dining hall, wrapped in 3 blankets, a glass of brandy trembling in his hands. A young nurse was beside him, speaking to him in soft, comforting tones. He was playing the role of a traumatized victim with nauseating perfection. Our eyes met over the nurse's shoulder. For a fraction of a second, I saw the pure terror on his face. The terror of a creature who thought itself safe, only to find that the monster it left behind has followed it out of the abyss. He stood up abruptly, muttering an excuse to the nurse, and headed for the deck. I followed him. The night was beginning to give way to the first pale gray of dawn. The air was still biting. I found him at the stern, the same spot where he had reveled in the disaster's beginning. "You survived," he said, his voice a little unsteady. "I am older than the rocks you play with, Cassian." Of course I survived. What do you want, Lysander?" "Revenge. That's such a human emotion." "It is not revenge," I answered, my voice as calm and cold as the sea around us. "It is balance. You opened a door that should have remained closed. You feasted on chaos. You broke the one law that keeps us hidden. Do not attract the attention of the old gods." He tried to smile, a nervous twitch of his lips. "They were magnificent, weren't they?" "They were hungry," I corrected. "And the meal is not yet over." He didn't understand until I grabbed his neck. There was no spectacular fight. He was strong, but he was weakened by fear, and I was fueled by 1,000-year rage. With a single, clean snap, I broke his spine. His immortal body went limp in my hands. He was not dead, not yet, just paralyzed. You awakened them with your arrogance, I whispered in his ear as I dragged him to the railing. It is only fitting that you join them in their sleep. And, without another word, I threw him overboard. There was no scream, just a dull splash as his body hit the dark water. I didn't need to look to know what would happen. Still, I could feel their presence, still nearby, drawn to the cold light of an immortal who could no longer flee. He would have a long, long eternity to regret his game. I went back inside, blending once more into the crowd of lost souls. I disembarked in New York, an anonymous face in the tragedy. The newspapers screamed the names of heroes and villains, told stories of love and loss. They built museums. They made movies. Sir, they never knew of the silent hunt, the abyssal terror, the true reason the unsinkable met its fate. Today, more than a century later, the world has changed. But I have not. Sometimes I read about the Titanic. Boos. I see the photo of that young heiress from Boston who survived and lived to an old age, never knowing that the silent stranger who threw her to safety was not an angel, but something much older. They call it tragedy. I call it memory, one among countless others. A reminder that no matter how high the towers humans build, no matter how unsinkable their ships, the ocean will always be deeper, the night will always be darker, and there will always be monsters in the depths, and sometimes on the deck as well.